All right. So looks like I think for the most part people are relatively in. So we will go ahead and get started. My name is Dirk Smith. I am a Master's of Science candidate at the in Psychology and Sports and Exercise at the German Sports University in Cologne, Germany. I also sometimes go by David Smith, but growing up, there's only so many David Smiths that you can have in a household before things get a little confusing. So Dirk Smith it is. Um, thank you for coming to the webinar, and thank you for signing up to learn more about the psychological impact of homophobia in sports. This is a topic that's very important to me personally because it inspired me to pursue psychology and sports and exercise for my master's degree, and a lot of it is based off personal experience. So while during the webinar I'll kind of go through a lot of the more like social psychology aspects of it, a lot of it is based on personal experience of my own experiences as a kid growing up and being involved in sports and being a young gay kid trying to figure myself out and stuff. And I think it's a story that kind of a lot of people can relate to. So at the end of the webinar there will be a few minutes available, so if you have any questions or have any discussions, I'll also have like my social media info as well. So if you want to get in touch later on, if you want to have any questions or have any feedback as well. So I thank you all for coming to this webinar because it's actually my first ever webinar of this kind. So any feedback that you have on things that I can improve, or maybe things that weren't entirely clear, or maybe that you didn't fully understand, I really appreciate if you could give me that feedback so I can learn and improve as I go along. All right. So the psychological impact of homophobia in sports. So currently, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's the perceptions of diversity and inclusion in sports include things like pride nights, sports teams wearing rainbow jerseys. Lately, there's been a bunch of like professional sports teams and leagues that have been sponsoring LGBT sports events, as well to try and promote a sense of inclusion and diversity within their league and trying to, I guess, in some way promote and try to get it so that LGBT athletes and specifically gay athletes will try to come out, right? And try to make it so that there's a sense of inclusion within that culture. The problem is, though, is that these organizations don't actually make the internal changes necessary to promote this environment of inclusion and diversity, especially in team sports, right? So team sports, athletes face a lot more challenges than they do in individual sports. You have a lot of aspects in terms of the social environment of the team, in different things that individual athletes really don't often face. The most recent example of this is from this July. For the Colorado Rockies, a player named Ian Desmond actually is boycotting the 2020 season. I don't know if you read that article on Outsports or any of the other news articles, but he is boycotting the 2020 MLB season to protest the prejudicial and discriminatory culture that is ingrained within the league, specifically noting experiences of racism, sexism, and homophobia. So it is unfortunately still very prominent in 2020. If you look on the graph I have right here, it is from a study by a researcher in Australia who did the first international study on homophobia in sports, and it's a sociological study where he has a sample size of almost 10,000 people. You can see that there's 4,600 are identified as gay, 1,300 is lesbian, 700 is bi, and then 2,500 is straight, and then about 200 is other. So one of the big things that he noticed is that even in our current era, there's been a large percentage of people who have witnessed or experienced homophobia in a sporting environment, both as a player and as a spectator. And he specifically draws up a comparison of participants over and under the age of 21. So if you look on the black part right here, where when he asked, have you experienced or witnessed homophobia in a sports environment, either as a spectator or a player, it's pretty high. 79% of people under 22 have experienced it, and 80% of people over 22 have also experienced it as well. So it is definitely one of those things where it's still very much present, even though we are really trying hard to overcome it, right? So in terms of the actual existence of homophobia in sports, using the same sample in the same study, as you can see, it's present in all different types of sports, right? So youth sports, of course, with like little league teams, high school teams, various sports on that level. A big one, of course, is PE classes, right? So physical education classes. And I know a lot of people, including myself, have negative experiences from PE classes, and they're just not as much fun. And there's a lot of things that going on that already take into account the craziness of the school environment for being a young gay kid, and then you add in the whole physical activity and craziness of physical education, which just makes it worse. And then you also have, spectators, right? So spectators at youth sports, spectators at professional sports, college sports, these crowds, they can get a little crazy sometimes. And then, of course, adult sports, right? So, college level sports and elite sports, professional sports, and even recreational sports. Okay. So, there is still some, uh, you know, levels of homophobia that exist even on the recreational level. And then you have the media coverage. So, how does the media portray aspects of being gay in sports, right? So, when they ask questions about, oh, what would you do if there was a gay athlete or something like that, that always adds to it, and it creates an extra level of stress and anxiety for gay athletes who are still involved in sports, who are maybe on the fence of whether or not they should come out. It still kind of creates an uncomfortable environment for them that makes it so that maybe they won't be as comfortable coming out in that environment. So when you look at the types of homophobia that exist in sports, of course, you have homophobic language, which is usually the most common. It can be both direct language, so one person specifically calling another person a derogatory slur or something like that that is considered homophobic. But then you also have the indirect, right? So when people just kind of say these slurs, but they don't really understand the meaning behind them, but they're using them casually in their normal language. You know, kind of just relating with their teammates and all and everything like that. So that's still pretty common, as much as we try to resist against it. And then of course you have like verbal threats, verbal harassment, bullying, physical assault, and all the different ways that homophobia can manifest itself in such a tight knit environment. And if you look on this graph as well, it's the same study from the researchers in Australia, and they talked about how whether or not people view homophobia as being more common in sports than it is in general society. So if you look on the gray and the purple, those are both agree categories. And if you notice that generally more than 50% of people agree that homophobia is more common in sports and compared to general society. The only category here that is less than 50%, but it's still really high, was among the lesbian participants who participated in the poll. So, but even then, it's still pretty high in terms of just, that they feel that there is still homophobia. That's more common in sports than it is in general society. As far as participation in team sports, so it is good to differentiate between individual sports and team sports. And since, we're focusing on football for Football Pride, we're going to focus on team sports also because it makes it more difficult, in my opinion, for gay athletes to come out in a team sport than it is an individual sport. So you have a lot of representation in individual sports, but in team sports, there's some extra levels of stress and anxiety and things that I'll go into in a few slides from here that make it more difficult. So in terms of actual participation in team sports, if you look on the graph, they measure between gay youth and gay adult, and then lesbian youth and lesbian adults. And unfortunately, I was not able to find any research on straight youth and straight adults to understand if there was a difference between the participation of team sports between the youth and adults for straight people, and then compare it with that of gay people and lesbian people. So the biggest difference that you can see, of course, is between the gay youth and the gay adults. So, we have a bunch of different countries here that they took their measurement sample from, and they noticed that among gay youth has pretty high percentage of of participants in team sports organizations. But then when you get to the gay adults, it drops pretty dramatically. So in all the different countries, you can see there's quite a big chunk of difference in the percentage there in terms of gay youth who participated in youth sports are no longer participating in sports as an adult. You see the similar kind of drops among lesbian youth and lesbian adults, but it's not nearly as dramatic. Okay, so it's significantly less percentage points, including even Australia, where it's like very, very small. So there is a clear problem here that the gay youth that are participating in sports as kids are dropping out and leaving sports as an adult. So these could be due to like bad experiences in PE classes, bad experience in youth sports, just these uncomfortable environments that created. We argue that PE classes are rooted in toxic masculinity and built upon gender stereotypes that gay youth just don't fulfill, right? So, this kind of leads to a terrifying environment built around bullying, harassment, jokes, degrading slurs. You often hear, if gay kids, that they don't even come out as gay. They don't even say that they're gay, but maybe they're just not as aggressive as their straight classmates, or they're not as interested in the sports as much as their straight classmates. But then it can lead to bullying and harassment and things like that, that unfortunately end up driving gay youth to quit from sports, leave a bad taste in their mouth of sports, and then discourage their future participation in sports. So that's kind of where the big problem is here in terms of the actual participation in team sports, is that we have a lot of gay kids who join sports, but then they get so bullied and harassed and end up leaving the sports that they just don't want to have anything to do with it later on. Unfortunately, the problem is that coaches actually never learn why these kids quit, right? So the kids, they just want to quit. They just say, you know what, get me out of here. I don't want anything to do with this. The coaches never understand why. Even the parents don't understand why, or anybody else understands why, because it's usually a personal matter for the kid, right? The kid may not fully come to terms with them being gay, but they just know that, hey, whatever's going on in here is making me feel bad, so I'm going to quit. So unfortunately, when these kids quit, the coaches never learn. And when the coach never learns, then there can't be any action that is taken to change the environment and discourage homophobia. And that's, I think, a big problem, that why we still have this issue persisting, because the kids quit, but nobody understands why the kid quit. And then there's no changes that are made within the structure of the team or the structure of the organization that help to change, so that, in the future, kids won't experience these toxic environments. So in terms of mental health, of course, I think a lot of people can understand that homophobia affects mental health. I mean, the LGBTQI community has one of the highest rates of mental health issues among a lot of minority communities, and a lot of it is attributed to homophobia. And homophobic behavior, environments, including social rejection, language, microaggressions, discrimination, harassment, bullying, all these things, they really kind of screw with your mental health. It can lead to higher rates of depression, drug use, anxiety, social isolation, and even up to suicide. And that's just not a good thing in general, right? But in sports, when you have these environments in sports, then of course it makes it even worse. Unfortunately, gay youth are twice as likely to be diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, including things like depression, bipolar disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, when compared to their straight counterparts. So unfortunately, it's still something that is very common just in general society, but then it also exists in sports, because sports is a very, very tight-knit environment in which these kind of problems can manifest itself. In terms of actual sports performance, it is well established that mental health influences sports performance. In terms of sports psychology, there is not much actual research directly relating homophobia to sports performance. So that's why for this webinar and for the work that I'm doing right now, we have to kind of draw the bridges, right? Because we know that mental health influences sports performance, and we know that homophobia affects mental health. based on a lot of the sociology research done by, the researchers in Australia. Even at the German sports university where I attend, there's a big research project going on there about homophobia in sports. And they've been able to come up with some very enlightening statistics in terms of the actual participation and experiences of LGBT people in sports, and especially how, they experience discrimination and harassment and things like that. And then that includes 48% of gay men who hid their sexual orientation when they were participants in youth sports and PE classes, and they were afraid of being bullied and rejected by teammates. 31% of gay men feared discrimination from coaches and officials, and I can safely say I fall into that statistic, unfortunately. So that anxiety, that stress, that fear, all of that each individual carries with themselves affects their performance, and it affects their mental health. Athletes with depression, anxiety, chronic stress, mental illness, social isolation, and all these other mental health issues, they show decreased levels of motivation and decreased levels of task engagement and volition and mental resilience. And ultimately, it affects their performance. So unfortunately, when these athletes have to deal with these kind of things and they don't have anybody that can help them deal with it, their performance suffers. And so kind of leading into the main point of this webinar is that homophobic sports and PE environments affect and undermine what are known as the three basic psychological needs that drive human behavior and motivation. So this is a theory that actually came up by a couple of researchers named Desi and Ryan, who wanted to understand and model the different things that motivate and drive human behavior. And they called it SelfDetermination Theory. And this chart right here kind of lays it all down. And it starts with the basic psychological needs that each person has that help influence their motivation and behavior in everything that they do, right? So sports, getting up out of bed, taking a shower, going to work, all this stuff. And it's a very common model that we use in sports psychology because it helps us to understand what motivates individuals who are participating in sports and how can we use that to help them improve their sports performance and well-being and all these other things, right? So the basic psychological needs start with three different things. So you have the need for relatedness, the need for competence, and the need for autonomy. Okay. So in terms of actual relatedness, I mean, everybody feels like that they need to have, some kind of social support network, right? So friends and family, colleagues, acquaintances, whatever you want to call it. We all need to have a social network, right? So the social support is a very important thing. And we want to be in an environment where we feel like we can be supported. As far as competence, it's something that we want to feel like we are capable within that environment, right? So the things that we're doing, we feel like we can learn and improve upon and feel like that we actually are contributing. And then of course, autonomy is just being able to feel like you have some sense of control over the things that you do, right? So, the decisions that you make are respected, and, the things that you're doing are something that you feel like is going to be helpful. And so the different levels of fulfillment for these three psychological needs all impact how we are motivated to do certain things. And when you talk about the fulfillment of these basic psychological needs, mental health is a very important aspect of that, because the environments that we find ourselves in all affect how fulfilling we are in terms of relatedness, competence, and autonomy. And that in turn affects our motivation, which leads up to this, kind of chunk of graph up here, right? So there's basically three types of motivation. There's a motivation, which is you're not motivated at all to do anything. It's just not going to do it. Extrinsic motivation, and that's when you're motivated by some kind of external factor. And so you can see there's kind of four types of that. It could be anything from avoiding failure or avoiding a punishment, right? So, you better get this done before, you get grounded or, you get in trouble. You can also have like, oh, you're doing this because you want to win a medal, or you have a cash prize that you're winning. That's why you're doing this, right? And then of course you have the introjected regulation, where you talk about how, oh, I'm doing this because if I don't do it, I'm going to feel guilty. And then you come up here to identified regulation, where it's, hey, I'm doing this because this is a goal that I set for myself. I'm going to work out 1 hour a day because this is a goal I set for myself. And then when you get up to the integrated regulation, then it's something that you want to do because it's important to you in terms of your own values. And then all of this leads up to the most important aspect of it, which is intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is you want to do something purely because you love it and you enjoy it and you have fun and it's challenging and you're not getting anything out of it more than you just loving it. And in terms of participation and performance output in sports, these are the kind of athletes that we really want to have and the way that we want to get our athletes to become. We want them to enjoy themselves and have fun and be a part of sports. And I think that's what's one of the more important aspects of this entire discussion is, why do we do sports? Are we trying to do it for the money? Are we trying to do it because, all these other things? But in the end, it's fun and we enjoy it. And that's what's important. So all these things are things that we can help build upon in terms of combating homophobia in sports, right? So we know that homophobia negatively affects the basic psychological needs. So the feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness all can impact your motivation, task engagement, and volition, which affect your well-being, performance, and creativity, okay? So the goal is that we want to build and we want to fulfill these social basic psychological needs, right? So in terms of youth sports and PE classes, the whole purpose of them should be just to have fun, to teach kids about sports and to be physically active and hang out and do these things that they enjoy doing. And that's what helps them develop a love and passion for the sports. So when we can do that, we can help fulfill these basic psychological needs, which in turn help them be more involved and more engaged in the sports, more motivated in the sports, and ultimately improve mental health, improve their performance, improve their creativity, and give them a whole new set of skills that they can learn upon. And we know that gay people love sports, right? I mean, football pride exists because we love sports, and events like gay games and all these LGBT sports leagues and organizations and stuff, like, sports are awesome. And there's a lot of benefits that sports can provide for us: physical benefits, mental benefits, social benefits, all these things that we can do with sports. So what do we do to help improve people's involvement in sports, especially when it comes to combating homophobia? So like I said before, individual sports do have more out athletes than team sports. And in individual sports, the biggest difference you have, obviously, is that there's no team. Even in a sport like swimming, you might have a swim team or a triathlon team, but it's still an individual sport because the athlete is still able to choose what kind of events that they want to do, and they train on their own, and they don't need to depend on other teammates to help them be successful in the sport. So in a lot of ways, individual sports actually help fulfill those basic psychological needs more than team sports does. And that's why we really need to focus on that in terms of being able to do this for team sports and teams that create inclusive and diverse environments that are designed to fulfill autonomy, competence, and relatedness needs of the athletes are generally more successful. You just have a higher well-being of the team, higher motivation of the team, and that just makes everything else in terms of training and practice and competition way much easier because you have athletes that are intrinsically motivated and they want to be there. Plus, in the end, it also improves your interest, right? So you get more people involved. So you find it easier to recruit new people and just have a more fulfilling and productive team. So in terms of actual inclusion, we need to start from the beginning. We need to focus on youth sports and PE classes because that's where it all begins. A lot of times we talk about how, the NFL or the NBA or MLB or NHL or somebody just needs to have that one professional athlete that has the courage to come out. And once they come out, the floodgates will open and all the gay athletes will come out. No. We've seen this happen already. I mean, Jason Collins, Michael Sam, a bunch of other gay and bisexual athletes who have come out of the closet, but there's no floodgates. Where's the flood, right? And every time that one of these athletes come out, the entire community of professional athletes who are gay are looking at those people to see what happens, and then they're deciding based on that if they actually want to come out themselves. And so far, it's not been very, very encouraging. The problem is that because gay athletes are not visible, not everybody understands that they're still there, right? So every coach has had or will have a gay athlete under their guidance, but they may not always know it, right? Because, coming out is a very personal thing, and maybe, it could just be the person's choice themselves if they want to come out or not. But for us, what that means is we need to show that gay athletes are accepted in sports through intentional behaviors that promote inclusion and diversity within the environment. And that's the big thing. So it doesn't matter if anybody on the actual team is gay or not. What we need to do is still make it clear that they are welcome and accepted in that environment, so that if the athlete does choose to express himself and chooses to come out, he knows that it's a safe place for him to do it in, right? Especially for us sports professionals, that we need to make sure it's up to us to create these sports environments that fulfill the basic psychological needs of gay youth, right? So what are the issues that are affecting gay youth that are driving them to quit sports, and it's, all these things that we talked about, right? So the harassment, the language, the bullying, and everything like that. What can we do as sports professionals to make sure that these environments are more inclusive and more diverse and more adapted to the basic psychological needs of the gay youth that will be in these environments? And that's where the diversity training comes in, right? So we need to make sure that we can train these sports professionals to learn how to deal with these kind of issues. And if an athlete does choose to come out, what do we do? How do we talk to the athlete? How do we respond to this? And what do we do to make sure that that athlete feels like they are comfortable and safe in coming out to their coach or their sports psychologist or fellow teammates or anything like that? So that's just kind of the basic rundown of this. So thank you for listening to my webinar. And if you have any questions, if you have any feedback or discussions, like I said, I think we might have a couple more minutes on my Zoom thing as well. So feel free to unmute your microphone and kind of raise your hand there. And also, please stay in touch as far as social media goes. You can find me on Twitter, and you can find me on Instagram. I'm also on my LinkedIn and got my Stonewall Fitness page as well. So feel free to reach out anytime, anywhere on there. So thank you so much. Hope you all found it very informative. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Football Pride.